Hello, welcome to No Longer Golden Ashes. We have officially rebranded, ladies and gentlemen. Moving forward, we will be the Inner Citadel. Kind of had planned on a rebrand from the start, and I felt like now was a good time to do that. Obviously, the name, the Inner Citadel, kind of playing off of Stoicism a little bit. Also playing off of some Catholicism, if you're familiar with Saint Teresa of Avila and the interior castles, although I am not Catholic myself. And then also kind of following in step with who we're going to be talking about tonight, the man himself, Julius Evola, Ride the Tiger, officially episode 2. Although we did do chapter 4 specifically in a live stream about 2 weeks ago. So if you have your copy of Ride the Tiger handy, tonight we will be covering chapters 5, 6, and 7. And then I think we'll have one, maybe two. Maybe we'll do one more live stream and one episode, kind of to bring the book to a close, and then we'll move on to our next title. We're going to be doing something a little bit different tonight. We are absolutely going to be talking about Ride the Tiger. Do not fret at all. But we're going to do it through a lens that it does compare Evola to some of the other thinkers in the space. I know usually we do bring up other people, the other hot button names, Rene Guénon, Friedrich Nietzsche, Martin Heidegger. Obviously, those guys are going to come up again. But we're also going to do some political theorizing. We're going to get into some Yockey. Not sure how many of you are familiar with Francis Parker Yockey, the author of Imperium, A Fascist Odyssey. Great book. We will probably cover it at some point, although we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty of it tonight. We are just going to cover the overlaps between Evola and Yockey. And we're going to begin by going from the initial period of nihilism that we talked about in chapter 4. And now in chapter 5, it's talking about a broader nihilism. We're going to be reading from the text a lot less today. I'm trying a different format out. We can see if we love it or hate it. Let me know either way, as we used to say in the Air Force. Any comments, questions, bitches, gripes, or complaints, feel free to leave them in the comment section. Or if you want to write a particularly scathing review, feel free to send me a DM and I will read it and internalize it. And I guess we'll go from there. I guess it depends on how scathing it is. So getting into it, the central claim here by Evola is a strong diagnosis of modernity, the modern world, as a spiritual flattening. So you want to think about this as the democratization of everything. It's pulling every aspect of society down to the lowest possible common denominator and kind of putting that person on a platform as a representative for the population at large. Evola gives a really good, probably the most coherent critique of modern culture. He doesn't give us a workable ethical or political framework. In fact, most of what he says we should do isn't political at all. he's not giving us a framework where we can take it and then go, okay, here's what Evola says. Now let's apply this to political theory, and we're going to apply this to the education system, and we're going to apply this to corporate America. That's absolutely not what Evola thinks you should do. Kind of in keeping in theme with the rebrand here, what Evola actually says we should do is not necessarily retreat. That's a strong word. But if you draw a line, a parallel line, if you will, between the Christian be in the world but not of the world, that's what Evola is going to be advocating for when it comes to riding the tiger. He says that modern European philosophy treats nihilism as a metaphysical condition and as a cultural crisis. And obviously, he thinks that a lot of this comes from not Nietzsche specifically, but the Nietzschean aphorism, God is dead. So with God being dead, culturally, not literally, Evola says that this is the underlying problem, that society has forgotten its man, really. So here we see the introduction of Heidegger. Man has forgotten how to be. He's forgotten what being is, what the essence of man is. And Evola frames this, obviously Heidegger's post-Evola. Well, they were contemporaries, but Heidegger really found his philosophical legs after Evola. Evola is going to frame this as civilizational decline due to the loss of transcendence. And where Nietzsche comes in here is that Nietzsche says that this nihilism occurs when the highest values devaluate themselves. So obviously Nietzsche's big thing is the transvaluation of values. Why do you believe what you believe? You should choose your own morality. And you want to choose it in a way that serves you. Nietzsche says that the nihilistic phase of either a man's life or of a society, a civilization, because again, you when we're having this conversation, you want to think about civilization or the civilizational lifespan, in air quotes around that, like you would a human being's life. Civilization is born, it grows up, it develops, it lives hopefully a strong, mature adult life. And then in the later years, it starts to decline and eventually dies and decays. So this calcification process, the process of civilizational declines, happens when the highest values within a society, be it honor or courage or think of America, you have commerce is highly valued. When these things start to devaluate themselves. Now, Evola's reading of this isn't necessarily that the values themselves are declining, but that you have a moral and cultural forms persist without spiritual substance. So it's not that the values have devaluated, it's that the a priori structures that made those values so important in the first place have begun to decline. And so your society is holding on to the moral framework that it had prior to the decline, but it's not grounded in the same thing. I don't know if any of you have listened to Barbarian Banter yet. It's with Jonas Kilker and the Great Dane. They had an excellent episode on that I would love to shill for a second, where they had Harry Miller from Instagram on an episode, and they talk about this, how we live in a post-truth society. And Harry Miller explains this as if truth is what grounds universal values and morality and ethics, external to the individual, if God is dead, which society, again, whether or not you believe this is the case, you might not believe this. I certainly don't believe this. But society, at least in the Western world, absolutely believes this. So if God is dead, and God is in Jesus Christ, the incarnation of truth, capital T truth, as the church would say, as my catechesis teacher would say. If Christ is capital T truth, but society thinks he's dead, again, not in a literal sense, then what you've done is you have uprooted the grounding for truth and you've moved it internal to the individual. And why this is important is because now truth is whatever I say it is. Because when you think of the Nietzschean project of the Übermensch, or you think of transhumanism, or even if you want to think of like the new wave of enlightenment, or post-enlightenment existentialism, what it does is it reframes each man as his own God. It's kind of Luciferian in that sense. And once you move truth external to the person and you now affirm each individual as being his own God, then because God is the arbiter of truth, that means that the individual is able to arbitrate on his own behalf that which is true and that which is not true. So if you're ever trying to argue with someone, either in a religious debate or a political debate or a philosophical debate, whether that's ethics or morality or metaphysics, and you're like, oh, well, I just need them to understand these few points and they have to agree with me. Well, what you don't understand is you are now challenging that person's godhood. So you are saying, hey, you're not God because there is a separate matrix of, at the very least, information, and it may contain truth, and I think it's true. So what you're doing is you're challenging them to an existential battle for the captaincy of their lives, or is precisely what is happening. The transcendental nature of man's relationship to truth has been uprooted due to one factor or another. We'll get into that a little later when we talk about Heidegger. And because of that, the moral valuations are still in place, but they've absolutely lost any connection they have to the transcendent. Now, Heidegger says that this is an ontological crisis. Now, what is ontology? Ontology is a philosophical term that essentially means the essence of man, the essence of humanity. So if you have ontological studies, it's a study of being or a study of becoming, depending on the context at which you're drawing your conclusions, or you're going to make your conclusions based upon. So Heidegger says this is an ontological crisis. So that means that this issue is a crisis of man's status in the universe. And as we just talked about, because man's relationship to the truth has changed in orientation, in connection to his view of God and man's own status in the universe, Heidegger's absolutely right. This is an ontological crisis. So Heidegger critiques the quantitative leveling. That is super loaded. We'll get into it in a second. And his other concern here with the ontological crisis is that we now have to engage with the spiritual consequences of technological modernity. Now, the key difference in posture here between Heidegger and Evola is that Heidegger is historically oriented, or he's more Spenglerian in the sense that he views this as a natural cycle of the civilizational process. Civilizations rise, civilizations fall, religions come and go throughout history. again, not necessarily my perspective, but these things come and go. And Heidegger anticipates this cycle kind of starting over. So Heidegger buys into the Spenglerian civilizational cycle. So if you have like Gobineau or someone like that, or the fourth turning guy, something Turner, can't remember his first name, or a who's the other one? Thomas Carlyle's also a cycles guy, but he frames it in the cycles of the great men of history, not important to the conversation. So Evola rejects historical hope, and he argues for inner transcendence. Basically what this means is you're going to be involved in your day-to-day to whatever capacity that may be. You know, you have to make money. You have to pay your taxes. You got to pay your mortgage. The lights got to stay on. And instead, what you're going to do is you're going to retreat to a place of inner solitude, almost kind of like the Stoics would argue. So if you've ever read Marcus Aurelius, or if you're familiar with like Epictetus or someone like that, that is more or less Evola's stance here. Is you need to embrace a form of Stoicism when it comes to the way the world of modernity is operating in relation to you. So yes, you have to be involved in the cycles and in the day to day, but inwardly you should be unfazed. And this reminds me of a quote from Revolt Against the Modern World, where Evola says, regardless of pleasure or pain, I'm going to butcher the quote now. Oh my goodness, I just had it. Neither pleasure nor pain should enter as motivating factors when one is doing that which must be done. Obviously, that is incredibly Stoic. Just to go off on a brief tangent here, if you think about someone like Yukio Mishima, right? Sun and Steel, Mishima, an accredited samurai, the last seppuku in recorded history. Mishima says one of his last quotes before he committed seppuku was, if the Japanese won't return to their honor, then there's no honor in living among the Japanese. And the samurai, if you understand the ancient samurai, you'll kind of understand Mishima, because as I said, Mishima was an accredited samurai. And the ancient samurai were an aristocratic military order that we all know. But what's a little less known is that they were also Shinto priests. So if you were a Shinto priest, at least of the aristocratic nobility, you were de facto a samurai. You had to be both. And you could only be a samurai if your father was a samurai. This was a genetic lineage. You couldn't just be born and then go to a school, like in Naruto or something. And just because you were born in the Leaf Village, you get to be a Leaf Ninja Warrior. No, your father had to be a samurai. His father had to be a samurai. You had to have noble blood. This is important because Evola is going to advocate for kind of like a aristocracy. I mean, the subtitle of the book is literally a field manual for aristocrats of the soul. So the aristocracy thing is really important here. But the samurai, they were a religious order. And when a child was about to start training to be a samurai, much like the Spartans, they were removed from the home very young. And it was a common chastisement that for parents of these children, before they would go into training, if they were being overly emotional or refusing to do something or throwing a tantrum, it was very commonplace for the mother to ask the son who was throwing this tantrum if this is how he was going to behave when his shogun asked for him to commit seppuku. And it's that level of detachment with your actions in the world that is what Evola is advocating for. He's advocating for almost a spiritual zealotry, to the point where the outcome of your actions, or rather the steps you take towards your actions, don't factor into whether or not you do them. Obviously, as an Orthodox Christian, disavow. But that being said, the samurai were admirable, and there is something at least romantically appealing about this sort of notion, right? I think, especially in the modern world, a lot of us could do with more action and less thinking. I know I certainly could. So this brings us to Evola's existential strategy. He calls it apolitia, obviously a cognate for apolitical in the English vernacular. Now, what is apolitia? If there are any Italian speakers in the audience, I apologize. Italian is not my first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, or ninth language. I don't speak it at all. So apolitia is an approach to modernity. It involves inner detachment, non-participation in the ideological myth of the day, and a sovereign inward form. Now, inner detachment, again, goes right back to what we were talking about. Neither pleasure nor pain should enter as motivation when one is doing that which must be done. You don't feel like going to the gym, it needs to be done. I don't care if it sucks to wake up early or to go after work when you're tired. You need to work out. Just some practical applications, right? Oh, I stayed up too late last night drinking and doing God knows what else. I feel like skipping church today. Neither pleasure nor pain should enter as motivating factors when one is doing that which must be done. Just go to church, man. Non-participation in the ideological myth. So if you're listening to this, I think it's safe to say that you fancy yourself on the right of political ideology, the political spectrum. So you are already, for the most part, not participating in the current ideological myth of the day. You're not buying into, social justice, progressivism, insert hot button topic here, but this is a two-way street for Evola. He says that not only should you be detached from participating in ideological myth in the broad sense, but also in like the bifurcated political system. We're going to go off on a quick tangent because I'm worried that I'll forget to do it later if I save the tangent for later. Obviously, Evola was a fascist, well known on the right for his political books, Revolt Against the Modern World. Obviously, this one, Ride the Tiger, although this one's not really a political book. Men Among the Ruins, Metaphysics of War is a huge one. We're definitely going to cover Metaphysics of War. I love that book. And so you, like I, might be sitting there when I first read this and going, but what do you mean detachment from the political process? You were literally a propagandist for the Mussolini regime. You were literally a fascist on your trial when they tried to arrest you for trying to cause a fascist resurgence in the 50s. Your defense was literally, I'm not a fascist, I'm a super fascist. So what gives? Well, if you know anything about Evola's political career, you'll know that he was actually kicked out of, not kicked out. They mutually parted ways. He was invited to give a series of lectures. I can't remember the name of the castle where the SS were based out of. And he said that, not to get too deep into it, but he's, Evola's ideas are very different than what Nazi Germany's ideas were. And he says that race, while important, isn't the end all be all. In fact, your race is downstream of your inward spirit. And he says, I want to say it's it's either the Hermetic tradition or maybe it could be Introduction to Magic Volume 1. He says that the body is incarnated with exactly that which the spirit willed before conception. And so he believes that if you are a lazy, good for nothing, that you're that way because you are at the core of your essence, in your soul, you're a lazy, good for nothing. And this is one of the reasons Evola never really broke into, well, among many, the mainstream in terms of his political theories, because there's a lot here that I think, looking at the political spectrum as a horseshoe, if you're familiar with horseshoe theory, there's a lot I think that even the left would find appealing about Evola and his detachment. Now, maybe not the modern left, but certainly looking back through the eras. And so he was thrown out of not thrown out, mutually departed from the SS when he said that race is important, but it's not the end all be all. And essentially that he has been around other Europeans or even other Italians and has felt alone because spiritually they were peasants. And Evola famously is the Baron. So he ultimately ended up very dissatisfied with fascism, and he thought that it lacked a transcendent spiritual component, and it focused too much performatively on biological factors, and that any kind of spiritual transcendental mode that it had was purely for propaganda's sake and not because it actually bought into it. And he ultimately left the fascist party feeling like fascism is a modernist movement. So if you're looking for a critique of fascism from the right, Evola actually wrote a whole book about it called Fascism as Viewed from the Right. And if you're looking for a reason not to be a fascist, if you're kind of torn between political ideologies, I highly recommend you read it. So anyways, back to the podcast. Some of the critiques of this political system, or hit this specific apolitia from a modernist political critique, is that it avoids mass politics. It doesn't engage in the democratic process, by golly, and that it risks ethical and civic disengagement. Oh my goodness, you're not doing your civic duty. You didn't go vote. So those are kind of like the normie tier critiques. So what are the political implications of Evola's apolitia? Well, as we just discussed, Evola heavily critiques fascist populism. And when he was promoted to his role within Mussolini's regime, he was obviously writing pro-fascist stuff because this was at the beginning. And he thought that it was going to be a good thing. And he started writing this pro-fascist stuff. And he had a friend who worked for Mussolini, and he introduced him to Mussolini, and Mussolini gave him essentially free reign to write about whatever he wanted. And so he ended up being one of the only people in fascist Italy who was allowed to criticize Mussolini and the regime's policies. By the way, I apologize if you hear my dogs barking. They are borderline feral. No clue what they were barking at. So he was one of the only people in a fascist Italian regime who was able to criticize fascism, and he ended up criticizing it so much that they stopped letting him. And then also, Evola is one of the few people that offers a metaphysical hierarchy that can be adapted by anti-democratic movements. So whether you're looking at something like Rise Above or Will to Rise, or the New Columbia movement, something like that, something on the right that is anti-democratic. It's not big tent conservatism. Oftentimes, even if they don't align fully, as I myself do not align fully with Evola and his positions, it's pretty impossible in the current political discourse to be anti-democratic and not at least be heavily influenced by Julius Evola. Now, a critique of this from a modern framework or from liberal theory is that this rejection of equality undermines the dignity and rights of people. Oh goodness, that's problematic. Democratic theory says that apolitia undermines public accountability. And of course, the most important one here, the Christian theology, the specifically Orthodox theology, says that apolitia has strong neglect of humility and grace on an individual level. It's going, if you have this aristocratic sense about yourself, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, for you to receive the grace of Christ the way you should be, again, if at all. All right. So what are some of the strengths of apolitia or Julius Evola? Well, it is an acute critique of modern flattening. It absolutely is. It's one of the strongest. Evola's perspective on nihilism and what the root causes of nihilism are is one of the strongest critiques against the democratization process that we see throughout the Western world today. He also engages with nihilism in a serious manner, where most people who engage with it, like your Jean-Paul Sartres, like they see it almost as a toy and something kind of like fun and hip to, oh, I'm a nihilist. Although he was French, would be like, oh, I'm a nihilist. And then the other thing that Evola does is he has a rejection of sentimental progress narratives of like the sake that we're making progress. This is a whole other video that I'm working on, or podcast video. I haven't decided yet. I did just start an Instagram account. So if you're listening to this and you need something new in your algorithm, please go follow me on the Interior Citadel on Instagram. I only have one post up right now. I'm working on a couple scripts, and this is one of the things I'm going to talk about first is sentimental progress narratives. Tying it into a few other key concepts. It's gonna be a series of releases, but if you're interested in that, I'm going to be putting up kind of like short form content that interacts with, but doesn't necessarily step on the toes of the content I'm making here. So what would the best use of Evola be coming out of this? So out of this podcast, out of the book, Ride the Tiger, if you read to chapter 7 and you're like, okay, I'm done. Well, it would be provocation and diagnostic lens. So Evola is one of the few writers that you will read. There we go. Who requires something from you, right? Like if you want to live your life to the fullest, it's not just gonna be like, well, read this book and feel good. Like Evola requires effort on your part. And then of course the diagnostic lens through which he interprets what is happening to the world, specifically in the West. But if you're like me and you're a Christian, Evola is going to be more credible as a critique rather than as a prescription. Now, again, there are some ideas that we can take as prescriptive in the sense of what we can do in order to solve the problems. Obviously, apolitia, a lot of people don't vote. Like think of someone like Jay Dyer, who's pretty disengaged from the political process and is kind of just hammering down what's going on behind the curtain. That is absolutely apolitia. Maybe not in the same way Evola would go about it, but it is apolitia nonetheless. All right. Now, traditionalist philosophy in Ride the Tiger. This is where we are going to kind of compare and contrast Evola between, like I said, we're going to get into a little bit of Yaki. But first, so in Ride the Tiger, Evola diagnoses. There we go. Western modernity as a period of spiritual collapse where transcendence has been lost, values persist only in their hollow forms, and this metaphysical critique parallels his broader traditionalist project, which you could find in Revolt Against the Modern World, which we will absolutely be covering at some point, in which he contrasts ancient hierarchical orders with modern egalitarian and materialistic cultures. Evola's project is not merely political, but metaphysical. He seeks a stance, such as apolitia, or refusing psychological attachment to social myths, to endure cultural dissolution. So for Evola, we are absolutely in the end game, but unlike Heidegger or Spengler, he doesn't really have hope for the process starting again, because for Evola, all of recorded history happens in the Kali Yuga. It's been like 64,000 years or something since the last golden age. And then Evola in Fascism as Viewed from the Right, he offers a critical analysis of fascism, not as an uncomplicated endorsement, but as an attempt to forge an alternative to liberal democracy and socialist egalitarianism. He argues that fascism revived the idea of the state and political authority against modern individualism and mass liberal democracy. He also criticizes its totalitarian tendencies and petty moralisms that deviated from his ideal hierarchical order. He also distanced himself from Nazi racial doctrine, calling racialism vulgar, even if he sought a different metaphysical foundation for order. Evola's work, Fascism is Viewed from the Right, makes policy judgments about fascism historical articulation, but do not reduce his philosophy to party politics. He positions himself above mass politics, which ultimately fascism and Nazism were. One of Evola, like, unironic critiques of fascism and Nazism were, no thanks, I don't like democracy, because Mussolini and Hitler were both voted in, and he hated that. A real leader, a real king, a real sovereign establishes himself as ruler, not the population, not the masses. Position himself above mass politics in favor of hierarchical metaphysical order rooted in tradition, an elitist vision distinct from both liberalism and communist egalitarianism. So how does this blend with Francis Parker Yockey and his work Imperium? So Francis Parker Yockey in Imperium, it's a separate post-World War II fascist manifesto arguing for a pan-European empire rooted in communal, racial, civilizational destinies. While Evola and Yockey did not collaborate, Imperium was endorsed by some traditionalists, including Evola, for its philosophical critique of materialism and modernity, even as Evola found Yockey's political strategy superficial relative to what he judged immediately feasible. So in Imperium, there is a Spengler-influenced cycle of history through civilizational decline and rebirth, racially framed vision of Europe that centers on unity and historical destiny, and alleges that post-war liberal states suppressed Western destiny, including disputing historical evidence of certain events around World War II. Yockey's work, the only reason I'm dancing around this is because this is going up on like Spotify and a few other places. Yockey's work has been widely criticized by historians as conspiratorial, and that it doesn't affirm the event, and that it occupies a distinctly fascist political space rather than a broadly philosophical or metaphysical one. You mean the book titled A Fascist Odyssey is fascist? Geez, I'm skipping that one. I think that's it for tonight, guys. Thank you so much for listening. Again, welcome to the rebrand. We'll be up on YouTube soon, doing things there. In the meantime, go Go follow me on Instagram. I almost said on Substack. Wow, I'm a dummy. Yeah, go follow me over there. Lots of new content coming again. We got one, maybe two more parts left. At some point next week, I'm going to be doing an interview with one of my buddies. He's publishing a book this year, and it's on Christianity and America moving forward. My buddy is a Christian. I'm a Christian. I'm going to continue to say that all the time because we get new listeners. At some point, maybe I'll stop saying it when enough people know, but not enough people know. I need everyone to know. Sorry for the reverb when I banged my desk, when I smacked my desk. Yeah. Thank you guys. We'll catch you later. Bye.